Welcome to PhD&D, everyone. I'm Dr. Bowers, and I just got back from Necronomicon 2024 in Providence, Rhode Island. It was a blast. I got to attend some really excellent panels, talk to some of my favorite scholars, some of my favorite game designers, some of my favorite authors, and got to talk shop about all kinds of things from game design to writing fiction to just sort of thinking about H.P. Lovecraft and weird fiction generally. It was a blast. One of the things I did, of course, was promote and talk about my game 5 Acts The King in Yellow RPG, and then, of course, as soon as I got back, I got the conference crud and became sick for a couple of weeks. I'm just now recovering, so I'm sorry for the delay on new videos, but now that I'm getting better, I am proud to announce that a bunch of new videos are on the way, including some Ravenloft stuff, but before that, let's do a video on how to run this thing, how to run this game, that is, 5 Acts The King in Yellow RPG. Now, this video is going to be a sort of tutorial or a set of instructions for game masters, or in the case of our game, maestros, and sort of just giving you the basics of how to run this game, how to entertain your players, how to make sure everything goes over successfully, and what to pay attention to when you're keeping the flow of the game going. In this order, I'm going to talk about choosing a main setting, starting the game, Act 1, an initial nightmare, running Act 2 as far as how the players wake up and convene with each other, running Act 2 as far as how the players consult the stage play The King in Yellow for the first time, running Act 2 as far as how the PCs consult the stage play The King in Yellow the second time, running Act 3, the second nightmares that the PCs share, running Act 4, the second waking episode when things really go off the rails, and then of course running Act 5, the Phantom of Truth, that last part of the game when all the players look back and reinterpret all the events and see what really happened after all. Those are 9 steps to the instructions, and each step will have a few sub-steps, and I will keep a running flowchart on the side here as I talk our way through all of them. So first, let's talk about choosing a main setting for the game. And when I say a main setting, I mean what the waking world of the game is. The ordinary waking world where ordinary people live and have their lives and events take place, including the events of the game. Here, when it comes to choosing a main setting, I have 6 basic tips. First, and most importantly, make sure that it's a setting where it makes sense that the player characters have read The King in Yellow, the stage play. That's the crucial assumption of every single game, is that the PCs have read The King in Yellow. So, don't set your game in some prehistoric time before the invention of theater or writing. And don't set it in some distant future post-apocalyptic age on planet Earth when writing has gone out of existence either. Second, make sure that the setting is realistic in the sense that there doesn't initially seem to be anything supernatural. Let it be some time and place that could pass for a real period of human history. So don't choose a high fantasy setting full of elves and wizards, and don't have some kind of weird space opera setting full of wacky aliens. Try to keep things down to earth, as it were. Also, and third, make sure that your main setting is full of ordinary people going about their business, which PCs can interact with, but not control. You want your setting to be populated, so don't set your game in a single jail cell where all the players are trapped together but they can't talk to anyone else. Don't set it on a desert island or anything like that. And a fourth note, relatedly, is to make sure that your setting is full of objects and set pieces which could lead to disaster and destruction and chaos if the PCs interacted with them the wrong way. Dangerous chemicals, heavy machinery, rickety structures. Basically anywhere where something dangerous could happen. Don't set your game somewhere that's like a suburbanized, child safety-proof home or anything like that. Make sure that there's some dangerous stuff in it. Also, when it comes to the size of your setting or the scope of your setting, make sure that it's large enough to contain several different areas or types of locations, but small enough where PCs could start at different sides of it and still reach each other by walking. So don't confine your game to a single room or a cramped apartment, but also don't let your game take place across the scope of an entire planet or country. Think of small towns, college campuses, a city's cultural district, multifunctional skyscrapers, a scientific outpost, large estates, basically any structure that has several different buildings or functional areas, but which holds fewer than 100,000 people. And finally, you want to tell your players what the main setting is, and who their PCs are generally expected to be. For instance, it's the year 2005 at the New Julian Academy School of Design in Boston. You and the rest of the PCs are art students, faculty, or otherwise affiliated with the school. Or, It's the year 1921 in Swanee's French Quarter in what used to be Louisiana. You and the other PCs are in one way or another tied to the dying railroad industry. Make sure that you tell your players what the setting is and get some buy-in. Now, with talk of the main setting out of the way, here are 3 tips when it comes to just starting the game. First, make sure that each player has chosen a PC. This isn't a complicated process. It's certainly nothing as complicated as, say, Dungeons & Dragons. Character creation is fast. You just need a name, a class, and a job. That's it. Have your players choose a character class, come up with a name, and a short explanation for why they're there in the main setting that you told them about. That's all they need. They don't even really need a backstory. After all, whatever their life used to be before they read The King in Yellow is kind of unimportant now. In fact, you should tell them that. You should begin your game session with something like this. Tell your players, your life used to be normal, even boring. But that was before you read the stage play The King in Yellow. Now that you've read it, you've learned some incredible things. You've learned that you're royalty, a legacy from beyond this world. You've learned that you have amazing supernatural powers. And you've learned that you must seek others, like yourself, find the yellow sign, and with its power seize your destiny. And with that, you should remind the players how to make skill checks, remind them what their powers are, and remind them that they should use their powers. And then, begin Act 1. Now when it comes to running Act 1, the opening nightmare, I basically have 9 little tips here. First, open with a hot start. The PCs are in direct and immediate danger. Don't wait for the PCs to trigger the danger by doing something. Don't wait for them to walk onto the big red X. No, make it so that they're already in danger and that's how the game begins. They're drowning in an ocean. They've fallen off a cliff. They're strapped down to surgical tables beneath looming figures that grip circular saws. Don't worry about how the PCs got into this mess. It's a nightmare after all. Jump straight to the terror and focus on that. Also, make sure that the location in which this nightmare takes place is obviously distinct from the main setting that you told your players about. If you told your players that the game is going to take place at an archaeological dig on a beach, then don't have Act 1 open up on a beach. Otherwise, it might confuse your players and they might not realize that they're in the middle of a nightmare. Now you might be thinking, oh, that would be cool. Why don't we play with the idea of whether the PCs are awake or dreaming? But trust me, no, it goes a lot better if you let the PCs know that the first part of this game is a nightmare. And on that note, and thirdly, make sure that the nightmare immediately strikes the players and the PCs as fantastic, to the point of eliciting phrases like, "This can't be real." So if the PCs are drowning in an ocean, make it an ocean of blood teeming with monsters. If the PCs are falling, let them fall faster and faster towards something huge, getting bigger and bigger without limit. If they're tied down to surgical operating tables, let them be tied down beneath the looming figures of skeletons holding bloody tools, singing songs about dead angels. Don't go for realism or subtlety here. Make it fantastically awful. Literally nightmarish. Also, and fourthly, when you're describing the nightmare, make sure that you let the PCs know that they can see each other in the nightmare. You should mention that each of the PCs look familiar to each other, but they haven't actually met yet. They've probably seen each other around wherever the setting is. Now, fifthly, once play begins in Act 1, you go around the table, and this is true in general, by the way. You always stay in a turn order and you just proceed in the same order around the table. In Act 1, let the players do whatever they want. Or I should say, let them try to do whatever they want. It's a nightmare, so you can always change what's happening, add elements, subtract elements, change elements. But let the players be creative with what their PCs do. Don't try to get them to do one specific thing or interact with a specific object or propose a certain sort of specific solution to a puzzle or anything like that. Let it be open-ended and just work with what they give you. And on that note, and sixthly, feel free to let players add elements to the environment. They can stipulate that certain sorts of objects are there or that the scenery is of a certain sort. Of course, as they do this, and you want to do this because it's a nightmare, you want to maintain the feeling of danger. Don't allow the PCs to have a moment of safety in Act 1 or in Act 3 for that matter. Keep the danger up, keep the hazards up, and keep the threat going. Instead of asking PCs, what do you do? Ask them, so how do you stay alive? And on a mechanical note, since this is a nightmare, don't forget to track its resistance. Remember, each nightmare has a resistance of 10, or 10 points of resistance. Each time a PC makes a successful check, they roll a d4 and subtract that amount from the resistance. So as the PCs make checks to struggle to stay alive in the nightmare, they're making more and more progress through the nightmare. You'll want to track that progress, so don't forget about that. In general, don't forget about your d4s in this game. If a PC's check is failure or success at a cost, they suffer 1d4 strain, and if they're in a nightmare and their check is a success at a cost or just a plain success, they inflict 1d4 strain on the nightmare. And finally, remember to include a clue in your nightmare about where the PCs should convene, or where they should go, or what they should seek out once they wake up. Remember to include a clue in the nightmare. If your nightmare includes an encounter with monsters, you might just have the monsters say the clue. They might say, "Seek where fire is cold," or "Go to where the paintings weep," or something cryptic like that. Don't pitch the clue with a specific idea in mind, like a specific answer that the players should arrive at. It should be open-ended, something that the players could talk about and arrive at their own solution to, or their own conclusion for. Or alternatively, another way to place a clue in a nightmare is to have a certain sensation that's out of place, like a certain sound that doesn't belong, or a certain odor that doesn't belong. If the nightmare takes place in a greasy engine room, for instance, the odor of freshly picked peaches would be out of place. You could emphasize the odor of fresh peaches as the nightmare proceeds. That way, when the PCs woke up, you could mention that peach odor again, and maybe that will clue the PCs as to where they should go next. A certain sort of sound that's out of place works really well, or perhaps a flash of an image, an apparition of sorts, something that doesn't belong but which would be a clue as to where the PCs should go once they wake up. And once the nightmare's resistance in Act 1 has been reduced to 0 by the PC's checks, we proceed to Act 2. So let's talk a little bit about Act 2, at least the first part of Act 2, when the PCs wake up and get their bearings and have to convene and meet each other for the first time. At the start of Act 2, remind all the players of the game's main setting, of the fact that their PCs were just asleep now, and of the fact that all their PCs have copies of The King in Yellow which they have been reading. You could say something like, "You awaken from nightmares of flying and falling. It's your third semester at the New Julian Academy School of Design in Boston in the year 2005. You must have fallen asleep just now, with your copy of The King in Yellow held fast in a desperate grip." Something like that. Second, having provided this initial description, go around the table and ask each of the players where their PC wakes up and under which circumstances. Invite them to add people and places and things to the environment, to embellish details if they wish, and of course to use the prompts on their character sheets. As gameplay proceeds around the table and each player describes where their PC wakes up, it should be clear that the PCs have just awakened from a nightmare, especially if you made that nightmare seem sufficiently fantastical and put it in a different location. And after the PCs have described where and how their PCs wake up and in which circumstances, remind them of that clue from the end of their nightmare, that cryptic utterance from the monsters, or that odor that was out of place, or that repetitive sound that was out of place. Remind them of that thing, and then go around the table and ask the PCs where they're going. If necessary, you could get really heavy-handed with the clue from the nightmare, and you should definitely feel free to let the players talk to each other about what they think that clue means. Let them metagame, as it were. That's fine. Let them do that. Chances are all the players will have their PCs head to the same location. If not, that's fine. Just have them run into each other on the way to that location. You need the PCs to meet up with each other. Gameplay cannot proceed unless that happens. Fortunately, it's an easy thing to ensure happens. And speaking of which, and this is part 5 of our How to Run 5 Acts The King in Yellow, once the PCs meet up in Act 2, they meet each other for the very first time, or at least for the first time in the waking world, and then it's time for them to consult that forbidden stage play that they've all been obsessed with. It's time for them to consult the King in Yellow. Now, when this happens, just tell them that. Just say something like, "Finally! Although you've never before met, you immediately recognize each other from that nightmare, and you recognize the copies of the stage play in each other's hands. Come now, the time has come to consult that play. Let us find your destiny and seize it." And at this point we commence with the 4-part process of consulting the stage play The King in Yellow. That's that 4-part process where one player comes up with a scary image, another player, the next player, interprets that image as a set of instructions, the next player decides how those instructions should be followed and leads the party in following them, and then another player, or the next player, deals with the chaos that inevitably ensues from the PCs following these instructions that are based on the interpretation of a scary image from this stage play. So once the PCs meet up together, they begin this 4-part process of coming up with an illustration, interpreting it as instructions, following the instructions, and dealing with the chaos that follows. When it comes to starting this whole thing, if any of your players have played this before, they might be enthusiastic to begin. Otherwise, you should just go in the same turn order that you've been using this whole time. The player who begins the first step describes how their PC is flipping through The King in Yellow until they find an illustration that catches their attention. Then they describe what that illustration is. So basically what the player does is describe a scary image. That's what the player does. Could be anything, a scary image. It could be simple, it could be complex, it could be blatant, it could be mysterious. It just has to be scary. And make sure that you feel free to enforce that requirement. The image they pick does have to be scary in some way. You could ask them how it's scary if you want them to fill in some detail. Without this requirement, gameplay tends to fall off the rails and get all weird and silly. And as they describe this scary image, make sure that they don't also interpret it. Don't let them say anything like, it's a severed head, which means we should... No. They just come up with the image. The next player interprets it as a set of instructions. Before that happens, though, once the player comes up with and describes a scary image, they make a check to see whether their PC can hang on to this image that's so scary. The PC isn't allowed to use their special powers to make this check, so it's 2d10s. Take the higher result, consult the chart, etc., etc. Now, if the PC's check is a failure, they suffer strain, and then it's up to the next player character to come up with a different image and do the same sort of thing. But if the check is successful, even success with strain, then play moves on to the next player, and that next PC must interpret the scary image as a set of instructions. What is the stage play telling us to do? That's the idea. And indeed, that's what the next PC does. They take a look at the illustration, they consider the scary image, and they decide what that image is telling them to do, what instructions it conveys. The only requirements are that first, the instructions make some kind of sense, they're based in some way on the actual illustration or image, and also that the instructions themselves are ominous or scary in some way. Once that next player proposes the interpretation of the illustration as a set of instructions, they too make a check. They can't use their special powers, so it's another 2d10 and consult the chart. And as before, if the check is a failure, you move on to the next player to propose their own interpretation of the illustration. But if their check is successful, you then move on to the next player who leads the rest of the PCs in an attempt to follow those instructions. So if the first player proposed an illustration of a bloody severed head, and the second player proposed that this means that they should go and decapitate the lord of the land, the king or something, it would be the third player who describes their attempt to lead the PCs into the throne room, past the castle gates and so on, to actually accomplish the bloody deed. And as with the previous two players, this third player would make a skill check too, but they will be able to use their powers. So if they want to, they could roll 3d10s, take the higher, and then consult the chart. Again, if the check is a failure, the PC suffers strain, and then you have the next player attempt to do the same thing. But if the check is a success, then things have probably escalated quite a bit. It will be the next player's job to propose how to deal with the chaos that ensues. And not just propose it, do it! That's the last step of this 4-step process of consulting the stage play The King in Yellow, after all. Deal with the chaos that ensues. Once the PCs have found a scary illustration, interpreted it as a set of instructions, and followed those instructions, chances are things have gone, well, to hell in a handbasket. Someone is injured or dead, something is broken or on fire, a dangerous beast has gotten loose, there's a precious resource that's running low, the guards are coming down the hall, the cops are arriving, etc. It's in the midst of this that the 4th step of consulting the stage play happens. The next player describes how their PC deals with this chaos. How do they lead the other PCs to hide, or to flee, or to do something that lets them fight another day? As with the previous step, this is a step where the PC can use their supernatural powers. So if they wish, they can roll 3d10, take the highest, consult the chart, etc. And as with each of the other steps of consulting the stage play, if the check is a failure, you move on to the next player who has their PC try again in a different way. But if the check is successful and the PCs have successfully managed the chaos, they're over halfway done with Act 2. They just need to proceed to a safe place and, well, do the same thing again. One more time, once more with feeling. Consult the stage play, The King in Yellow. Remind them that they just need to consult it one more time to seize their destiny and find the yellow sign. And to make sure that things stay fresh and fun, you could also mix up the turn order or mix up the order in which the players are going to do different parts of this consultation. You don't want the same players both times coming up with the image, or both times interpreting the image, or anything like that. Not at least unless the players want that. But if it looks like the same player is going to get stuck coming up with an image both times, you might consider switching the turn order. But in any case, just do the same thing again. Have another player describe how their PC flips open to a scary illustration, they describe the illustration, they make a check to make sure that their PC's mind can hang on to that ghastly illustration, and then it's off to interpret the illustration, follow that interpretation, deal with the chaos that results. And assuming that's all successful, Act 2 comes to an end, and the PCs proceed to Act 3. Now, in order to facilitate this transition, it's best to make sure that things escalate more and become more and more chaotic. Have strangers, both as individuals and as crowds, panic in response to what the PCs do. They scream, they surge, they run, they do unpredictable, violent things maybe. And as things escalate, in the midst of the chaos being managed, the PC should see or encounter something incredible, something yellow or golden in color, luminescent, and then they lose their consciousness. As for how they lose their consciousness or what causes it, well, that's up to the Maestro to decide whether they want to reveal. But after the PCs lose consciousness at the end of Act 2, they share another nightmare. Act 3. Only in this nightmare, the PCs have found the yellow sign and fulfilled their true magical potential. Act 3 is also a nightmare, so have it begin with a hot start. Once again, the PCs are suddenly in direct and immediate danger. The setting is supernatural. The setting is totally different from where they were before, in the waking world, and you might also consider making this second nightmare in Act 3 a continuation of the nightmare in Act 1. If you do that, I would just make sure that you crank the volume knob, as it were, to make sure that there are more monsters, and they're bigger, and they're scarier, and the threat is more gigantic. You want to increase and escalate between Act 1 and 3. And of course, as with Act 1, you want to keep up a sense of danger. You don't want to ask the PCs, oh, so what are you going to do? So what do you do? So what does your PC do? You want to ask, so how do you stay alive? How is your PC surviving this? How are you going to stay alive in the midst of all this? Ask questions like that, and keep the descriptions of threats and dangers potent. Here, it's also worth reminding your players that the PCs have indeed found the yellow sign. They have found that mystical glyph that they've been hunting for ever since they read that stage play, The King in Yellow, and that means that their powers are now, well, virtually boundless. If you take a look at the right side of the character sheet, it lists some sample uses for a PC's powers once they find the yellow sign, but those are only sample uses. You should really let the PCs get ridiculous with it. Before they found the yellow sign, a PC who was a grave worm could just make small clumps of matter decay by touching them. Just little bits of wall and structure and living tissue would decay. After that same PC finds the yellow sign, however, they could make whole buildings rot and fall by touching them, contaminate an entire field or even an ocean by dipping their finger in the soil or the water. Likewise, before finding the yellow sign, a PC who was a repairer of reputations could maybe compel a favor or two out of a stranger every couple of hours. That was the limit of their blackmail before finding the yellow sign. After finding the yellow sign, however, that same repairer of reputations would be able to command an army of millions to join death squads at the mention of a single word, no less. and so on for the other classes. Remind the players that their PCs have found the yellow sign, and that means not only an increase in their powers, but a sort of increase which means that they should feel free to make up fantastic things at this point in the game, especially now that they're in a nightmare. And speaking of which, don't forget that as a nightmare, this nightmare in Act 3 has a resistance of 10. So every time your PCs do something successful, that is, they make a successful check, either success without strain or success with strain, they roll a d4 and then subtract that number from the nightmare's total resistance. And as before in Act 1, once the nightmare's resistance reaches 0, the nightmare is over, the PCs wake up, and we proceed to the next act. In this case, we proceed from Act 3 to Act 4, the penultimate stage of the game. Now, in Act 4, when the PCs wake from their second nightmare, it should be a scene of disaster and chaos. Whatever crises you intended to introduce in your game, they are here in full force now. Earthquake, fire, riot, loss of containment, loss of oxygen, loss of fuel, strange bodies appear in the sky, tsunami waves loom over trembling coastlines, a kaiju incinerates skyscrapers like paper, human anatomy suddenly twists into monstrous forms, or whatever, it's an apocalypse. And at this point, the PCs only have one more thing to do. Navigate Armageddon, find a place that seems appropriate, and consult the King in Yellow one last time. What must they do to save the world, or conquer it, or seize their destiny? And during this act, during this final consultation of the stage play The King in Yellow, the PCs may want to do some incredible things. They might want to extinguish the sun, or raise an army of zombies. Let them! Go big. Let it get grandiose. Let it get crazy and ridiculous. In terms of narrative and action, this is kind of the climax of the game right here. Once again, the players go through that 4-stage process of thinking of a scary illustration, interpreting it as a set of instructions, following those instructions, and managing the chaos. As they do it in Act 4, however, try to nudge them and nudge events in a way where they get increasingly destructive and where it seems increasingly likely that the PCs will end up dead or utterly deluded or jailed or trapped somewhere. Make it clear that the PCs are not persisting past the end of this story, which is nigh. And once the player characters have consulted the King in Yellow this third time and the chaos has reached its peak, this final time unmanageable perhaps, Act 4 suddenly ceases, and we proceed to Act 5. Now, Act 5 is the final act of the game, and it's in this act that the players together step back and look back at the events of the game and reinterpret them from someone else's perspective. Earlier, from the start of the game and up until this point, the players have assumed that their PCs indeed have supernatural powers, and gameplay has encouraged them to hold this belief. In Act 5, however, the players are invited by the Maestro to consider the possibility that the PCs were delusional this whole time, that they never had any sort of supernatural destiny nor any supernatural powers. And the player's task is to explain different bits of the story as it would have played out without the supernatural. The Maestro is going to assume the position of an authority figure who's interested in getting to the bottom of what exactly happened. The players will play along and come up with other additional sorts of characters, experts or people to give testimony on the spot, and sort of offer their own interpretation of events. So for example, a Maestro might begin Act 5 like this. 4 figures enter the Chancellor's office at the New Julian Academy School of Design in Boston. Their reflections are blurred in the wall's oaken panels. Chancellor Archer stands. "Thank you for coming at such notice," he says. "These events really present us with some mysteries. I figured your expertise could help." Now, we have some reports that one of these perpetrators tore off a faculty member's arm and turned it to stone, but that doesn't seem possible. Sounds like nonsense, actually. So, what do you think happened exactly, Dr.? And here the Maestro will gesture towards one of the players. And that player can make up someone. They can say, Dr. Toboggan, Mantis Toboggan, actually. I'm a physician. And yes, I concur that that would be impossible. I imagine what might have happened is this particular student, disturbed of mind perhaps because of their failing grades, they probably seized a sculpture's arm from your sculpture department or your mannequin department or whatever you have here, and then used it as a weapon on an otherwise armless faculty member? Is that possible that that could have happened? Right? And the player hands the explanation back over to the Maestro, who says, oh yes, that might be possible. I have another question, however, of some reports of one of these perpetrators flying through the air. Let me turn to another one of our specialists here, a Mr. or Mrs. Right. And you go around the table and you ask about various things that happened during gameplay, things that would have been explained by supernatural powers, but which now, in absence of the assumption that there are any supernatural powers, require an additional explanation. That's your Act 5. You go around and you ask the players to explain what could have happened if there were no supernatural powers. What was really bothering their poor PCs? What moved them to be in such a delusional state? Is it the strain of their job? Is it a natural disaster that happened recently? And here, of course, it's good to bring up the mundane or the physical crisis that the Quick Start rules mention in how to prepare a game. But this is Act 5. Again, you go around and you have players contribute additional explanations to what was really happening, if not supernatural events. And you proceed for as long as is fun, for as long as is comfortable to compare these two different versions of the stories, go back and forth. And once you've had your fun with that, and it seems like play is winding down, there's just one more thing to do to finally close the game. And that's to have the Maestro's character, this figure of authority who called the rest of the figures together, add a little detail. Say, oh yes, one more thing. All of these perpetrators, they all had a copy of a certain book on them. A really weird sort of stage play about a yellow thing, a thing in yellow, something like that. We managed to retrieve these copies. I thought I would pass them along to each of you and see what you could make of them. Go home, take these, read them at your leisure. Maybe if you find anything out that could be of note, just come on back and report to me, and hopefully we can put together more of this mystery. And with that, the King in Yellow is transmitted on to more future victims of its influence. And that's how you run 5 acts, The King in Yellow. Now, I know that that might sound really intricate with all these different parts and pieces and all these different stages and phases of play, but once you've played a couple times, it becomes really natural, and the transition between these parts of play is really, really easy to run. I'd also like to add that even though it may sound restrictive to have play structured in this way, it's really not. What we have is the bare bones structure of a certain kind of story. A story with unreliable narrators. A story of the type that Robert W. Chambers embellished in his anthology, The King in Yellow. So give it a try, let me know what you think in the comments, and thanks very much for watching and for supporting 5 Acts The King in Yellow. As I mentioned before, I've got other videos on the way, including Ravenloft videos, more videos about indie TTRPGs, how to play some of them, and I'll be posting in my community and in the Discord in the meantime. So thanks for watching, do all the internet things, click like and subscribe, let me know what you think in the comments, and thanks!